coming on there, it's a BMW R75, as is the second, and the third one's a BMW R12. That's if you understand about motorbikes. I don't at all. The fourth and the fifth bike are Zundaps, R5750 they're called. Now, the issue about the Germans and their motorcycles, German industry in the 30s, you know, we have this idea with all these very sophisticated looking bits of kit, half tracks, etc., motorcycle combinations like this. Their motor industry was actually way behind France and Britain's, much smaller. And one of the points we were making earlier on to various people, you know, in World War II, the Germans actually used more horses than they did in the First World War. So there's a bit of feast and famine going on with the German military, some amazingly sophisticated, well-designed vehicles, as well as the use. 80% of German transport in World War II is actually horse transport. The motorcycle combinations, the Germans were quite clever how they used them. They were used even in the Panzer divisions in 1940, sent ahead, not just for reconnaissance, but for the very sensible reason, if they could get to petrol stations ahead before the owner decides to lock his pumps up or destroy the petrol, they could capture them. And that was one of the issues the Germans were not so good at in the 1940 campaign. In most of World War II, their logistics system was not as much living off the land. So one of the things these motorcycle combinations did in France in 1940 was scout ahead of the main force, making sure not only that things like bridges could be secured before the enemy could blow them up, but also to capture things like fuel stocks. Now, coming on as well, behind the motorbikes, is the famous German Kettenkrad. Sorry, Kettenkrad. It's the Now, Kubelwagens were, again, an idea that Hitler has a word with Ferdinand Porsche about the people's car, and he said, how can we make them for military use? And they do this very lightweight bodied vehicle. It's got an air-cooled engine in it, which again, for a military vehicle, when you think about it, is quite sensible, because it means that, again, if it's you haven't got a radiator that might be punctured by a bullet or a bit of shrapnel. Air-cooled engine, very light bodywork. It's got a body pan underneath it, so it can slide over rougher ground. And amazingly, it's not actually four-wheel drive, it's only two-wheel drive. In 1945, even though it's done up as an Africa Corps version from earlier in the war. And again, just as a little bit of an indication of, again, this idea of German production, 50,000 Kubelwagens were made, which sounds a lot in wartime use, but then if you compare that to the two vehicles behind, the American Jeeps, 500,000 Jeeps were made in World War II. And of course, these are just indicators of kind of the logistics and the supply issues of World War II. It's also that manufacturing capacity. However good that Kubelwagen was, the Americans were going to make so many more examples of an equivalent, and that's a Jeep. Now, the Jeeps originally designed by the Bantam company. The Jeep drawings were pretty much handed over to Ford and Willys company. They ended up taking them forward on behalf of the American government. Bantam ended up just making trailers for most of the Second World War. But that simple design, very functional, for Allied forces. Some go to the Soviets. And again, it was a perfect vehicle for its role at the time, four-wheel drive, and of course they carried on manufacturing post-war, so a lot of those around. We got an advert in the archive, I think it's back in the 70s, where someone imported 500 of them. 500 Jeeps, £500 each trailer. Lots and lots of modifications, of course, made to Jeeps, depending on the role it's playing. Now, behind that Jeep, there's a half-track, American half-track. This particular one's the M16 version of it. Just before the war begins, the Americans, they get the white scout car, what they call the M3 white scout car, four-wheel drive vehicle with four wheels on it, basically put a tracked body on the back of it. And that particular vehicle they then put into production as something called the M3 half-track. 1,700 of these versions were made. And what you've got there is basically used for anti-aircraft work. When they went ashore on the Normandy landings, they realised the Luftwaffe wasn't really that prominent anymore, and so they ended up using them in a ground attack role. And that very last vehicle, which is probably one of the most important vehicles, the GMC Truck there, one of those vehicles, that's what kept the American Army, a lot of the British Army, and a huge amount of the Soviet, Russian Red Army going in World War II, made again in vast...